Hey everyone, and welcome to video 2 of week 1. We're talking about what is philosophy this week. And so what I want to talk about in this video is the different areas of philosophy. I want us to talk about what sort of the boundaries of philosophy are so we can get a better sense of what philosophers are doing and what's happening when we do philosophy. So philosophy is often divided into sort of 4 main branches. There's logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and value theory. And logic studies arguments. Logic is the study of what arguments are good, what arguments are bad, which arguments rely on questionable principles, which arguments rely on solid principles, which kinds of inference, where an inference is something you do. For example, if you call your friend's cell phone and it goes straight to voicemail, you might conclude their cell phone is off, right? That's an inference. You got information, you called your friend's phone and it went straight to voicemail, and from that you inferred that your friend's phone must be off. That's an inference. That's a little mini argument that you had in your head. That probably happened so quickly that you didn't think about it. But it still happened. And that sort of inference, and much more detailed inferences, and arguments, like Andrew Weil's 100-page proof of Fermat's last theorem. That's an argument, a rigorous, logical argument, that is also something logicians might study and talk about. Logic is the area of philosophy that deals with arguments, both informal arguments, like the went to voicemail, therefore their phone's off argument, and also more formal arguments, like rigorous mathematical proofs. So these sorts of arguments and the formal languages and the formal systems we construct to handle arguments are sort of the topics that logicians study, that philosophers of logic study. And that's logic. That's the first branch. The second branch is metaphysics. And metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that basically deals with what stuff exists and what kinds of stuff exist. So, for example, does God exist? That is an argument, or that is a question in metaphysics. It's a question about whether or not this certain kind of entity, God, exists, or whether or not gods exist. That's a metaphysics question. It's also a philosophy of religion question, because there can be overlap, and we'll talk about that. But it's a metaphysics question, because it's about what exists. What minds are is also a metaphysics question. Is a mind a physical thing? Do we have a soul or do we not have a soul? Is our brain all there is, or do we have a mind that's somehow separate from the brain? Or is the mind something like software that the brain is running? Like how the mind and the brain relate and whether or not we have a soul and things like that are metaphysics questions. They're about what exists and what kind of stuff exists. Do non-physical things like souls exist, or do they not? Is everything physical? That's a metaphysics question. So if we're asking philosophical questions about what exists or what kinds of stuff exist, that's metaphysics. And the third area we're going to talk about, which is actually the first area we will start talking about, because we're going to talk about it next week. The third area is epistemology. And epistemology studies knowledge. It comes from the Greek word episteme, meaning knowledge. And so when we talk about what knowledge is, that's a philosophical question that is in the epistemology branch of philosophy. We're trying to find out what it means to know something. Because knowledge is stronger than just believing something or thinking something's true or betting that it's probably true. If you know something, then it's certain. in a way that it isn't if it's just your opinion or you just sort of are pretty sure or you believe it. Knowledge is something stronger. So what is knowledge? What is that extra strength it has? That's a question in epistemology that we'll talk about next week. Also, other questions like, can we ever trust our senses knowing that hallucinations and things are possible? How much should we trust our senses? How much should we trust testimony? If you are told by a friend of yours that something happened, but you didn't see it, can you know that it happened just based off being told about it? Or do you have to be there and see it in order to know it? That is a philosophical question about knowledge and about justification of beliefs. How justified in believing something can you be if you just sort of heard it through the grapevine? That's an epistemology question about evidence and knowledge and belief. And those sorts of topics, those sorts of issues are in the epistemology branch of philosophy. So logic deals with arguments and looks at arguments directly. Metaphysics looks at what exists and what kinds of stuff exist. And epistemology looks at knowledge and justification and belief and how we come to have evidence about something. What sort of evidence we can get from a single scientific experiment or from our senses or from testimony or from past experiences. Those are epistemological questions. And the fourth and final branch is value theory, which is a very broad category that asks basically questions about value. What's good and what's bad? What's right and what's wrong? So philosophy of art questions like what is the value of an art? And I don't mean trying to calculate how much you could sell it for. I mean, does art have intrinsic value independent of how famous the artist is or how much you personally like it? Does it have intrinsic value objectively? Is it possible for a work of art that no one alive cares about to be inherently valuable? That's a value theory question. Is it okay to pirate music off the internet? That's an ethics question. That falls under value theory. That's a question about what's right or wrong for us to do. What is it okay for us to do? And notice that I didn't say, is it legal? That's a separate issue. That's just look at the law, talk to a lawyer, you'll find out. This is what is it morally okay to do? That's separate from what's legal or illegal. Lots of things are perfectly legal but morally wrong. Cheating on your spouse, for example. Probably morally bad, but there's not technically any law against it. So it's legal, but still wrong. Or that's what most of us would agree to, that I think, anyway. So value theory, it asks questions about what it's good to do and what things are good and what it's wrong or bad to do. So is the death penalty okay? Is it okay for a government to kill a citizen for committing a crime? Is that okay? That's a value theory question. It asks, how much do we value human life? What is the value of a human life? What is it okay for a government to do? What is it not okay for a government to do? That's a value theory question. Should you cheat to get ahead? That's a morality question. That's about ethics. Is it okay to kill someone in self-defense? That's an ethical question. That's a value theory question. So value theory covers a lot of issues in political philosophy and philosophy of law, and philosophy of art, but a big important chunk of value theory is ethics. Is about what we should do, what we should not do, about what it's right or wrong for us to do. It's wrong to torture people for fun. It is good to give to charity. Those are both philosophical claims. Those are ethics beliefs. Those are ethics statements about what it's morally okay or not okay for us to do. And so if you agree or disagree with either of those statements, then you have a philosophical stance on ethics. You believe that some things are morally okay and some things are not morally okay. And later in the course, we'll talk more about ethics, and we'll try to get some better sense, not just of what's right or wrong, but of what makes things right or wrong, and whether or not there really is any such thing as right or wrong. Some people are called moral nihilists and believe that nothing is morally okay or morally not okay. Nothing is morally wrong. And we'll talk about that and other views in what's called metaethics, where we try to ask whether or not anything's morally okay and what makes things morally okay. And that is all in the value theory branch of philosophy. So those four areas, logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and value theory, are sort of the four core branches of philosophy. But beyond that, these different areas of philosophy can be applied to lots of different disciplines. So for example, there is an area of philosophy called philosophy of physics, which tries to interpret the equations of quantum mechanics or of relativity. Try to talk about, given what we know empirically from physics, how does space-time relate to our sort of intuitive concept of how space and time work? What is happening when the wave function collapses? Is that a real thing? Is that a feature of measurement? There are different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and philosophers of physics argue over those interpretations and try to figure out what interpretation is best justified by the data. Which interpretation best explains the data? It's all the same mathematical equation, but how we interpret it changes. Some people interpret quantum mechanics and quantum field theory to tell us that really particles don't exist at all. It's all just waves, and there's nothing beyond fields. Waves and fields, that's it. And that is one interpretation of the mathematical equations. But what physics experiments really get us directly is the equations. And then it's up to some philosophical thinking to try to interpret that. And sometimes philosophers, people employed in philosophy departments, are doing that interpretive work. And sometimes physicists in physics departments are doing that interpretive work. But in both cases, what they're doing is philosophy of physics, trying to figure out what we can infer from the data. What picture of the world is right or is supported by the empirical data that we have. And that's a philosophical issue. Philosophers of science ask different questions than scientists do, but there is a field called philosophy of science. Scientists ask what caused what. Philosophers of science ask what is causation? Like, what is the concept of causation? That is a philosophical question that philosophers of science try to answer. Scientists don't usually try to ask what is causation. They start with some assumption about how causation works, and then they try to figure out what causes a species to go extinct, or what causes a chemical reaction to occur, or what causes a supernova to occur. But philosophers of science try to ask foundational questions about what causation is, and sometimes whether or not causation even really exists. And that's because philosophers talk about sort of what are called foundational issues. They ask about the concepts upon which other fields are built. So a mathematician might try to prove some theorem about numbers, whereas a philosopher of mathematics will try to figure out what numbers actually are. Because numbers are weird things. You can't go out and touch them, but we didn't make them up. Math is clearly independent of us. No matter how hard you try, you can't make 2 + 2 = 5. So math is clearly like a real thing that exists outside of us, but numbers aren't physical objects you can go touch. So what are they? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but that's one of the questions that philosophers of mathematics try to answer. And so every field of study, math, the sciences, art, literature, history, archaeology, music, every area of study has some foundation, is built on some set of concepts, like the concept of a number or a set in mathematics, or the concept of a particle and a wave and a field in physics. And we can always ask questions about what these concepts are really picking out in the world and whether or not those concepts need to be adjusted in light of evidence. Sometimes they do. Physicists have a different conception of two objects being in contact than we do normally. We think of contact, two objects being in contact, when the space between them is 0, when there's no space between them. But it turns out that never actually happens. What's actually happening in these cases when we think things are in contact is that van der Waals forces are in equilibrium. I don't know what that means. If you don't know what that means either, that's cool. The important thing is that this is what's actually happening when we describe two objects as being in contact, is that these forces are at equilibrium. There's always some non-zero space between any two particles. And so physicists had to revise the concept of objects being in contact with each other because our original concept didn't fit the data, didn't fit the world. And adjusting concepts, which is sometimes called conceptual engineering, is a tool that philosophers and other people use when it turns out that the concepts we've been using didn't quite fit the world the way we thought they did. And that sort of change in concepts, or that new understanding of a concept, can change how we look at things. And that is one of the things that philosophers focus on, is understanding the concepts underlying both our day-to-day lives and other areas that we study. So next week, we're going to talk about knowledge, and we're going to ask what knowledge is. And in doing so, we're going to try to analyze the concept of knowledge. And that is something we'll talk about next week. We don't have to worry about that yet. So I'm going to stop this video here. Hopefully you've got some idea of the basic areas of philosophy. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about comparing philosophy to science and a little bit about the methodologies of philosophy, about how philosophy operates. So I'll see you in the next video. If you have any questions, please let me know.